Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Asher Marketing Podcast. I'm Anthony Giuliano, and our guest this week is Andy Welfle. Andy, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. Andy, you are my favorite person in California. Now, I say that not knowing a lot of people who live in California, but you are definitely the person I know best who currently resides in the Golden State. So how are things in California these days?
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, everything's on fire right now. And other than that, things are good. The weather is otherwise pretty clear. You know, we're all going to fall into the ocean from an earthquake at any minute. So like, I'm just, one day at a time.
Well, thank you for making all of our listeners go away. And yeah. I think this is going to be a series.
It's great, folks.
So you're currently in the process, you and I were just talking about, you're in the process of buying a home, which is another peril in California, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, this would be the first time for my wife and I to buy a home anywhere, but like I just look at some of the housing prices in Fort Wayne that we never took advantage of, and it just makes me cry a little bit. So.
Yeah. Well, you have moved on to some really great things in California, and we want to talk about that and hear about some of the differences between what your life was like in Indiana versus California. And I want to start with your career path because you have a super interesting one. And I know, you and I have known each other for some time, so I know some of it. Going to college in Indiana, then following that up with some work for some nonprofits, and then making a big leap to California. So can you talk to us a little bit about what your aspirations were when you were younger, how that worked out when you actually started a career, and where you've gone from there? Yeah,
it's been kind of a windy road, but I think that kind of at each step I honed in on like something specific that I kind of like focused and brought it to the next thing. But when I was in high school and college, I really, really wanted to be a journalist. So I wanted to work in a newspaper, maybe be like an arts reporter. That was always kind of my passion. And so I went to IPFW, RIP IPFW. I worked on the student newspaper there, and I graduated. And this was in 2006 when most of the newspapers, not only in Fort Wayne, but just in general, were laying people off. It was not a lucrative time to get into print journalism. So I had some connections and just followed some interests and passions. And I worked at the Fort Wayne Dance Collective in Fort Wayne. It's a small arts nonprofit focused on like modern dance and movement as health. And that was in like 2007. And I was working as the like marketing and operations manager. This was a really interesting time for a few reasons. One was because this was when social media was starting to become like something that businesses were using to talk to customers, and I was really interested in that. I've always loved communication, and I've loved technology, and I attended this thing called the Weil&I Leadership Institute, and I attended a class by you called something like professional communication in like corporate world or something like that. And
yeah, I always in those classes, I always try to quickly identify the smartest people in the room and befriend them so they don't eat me alive. So that was the case with you.
Right. And I mean, that just really renewed and just like made a lot of connections for me between like, hey, this is what social media is, and this is the way that like, you can connect with people using social media, and that just really interested me. So kind of the next step I took in my career journey was I really wanted to like focus on that. That was only a small part of my job. So I did a couple things, but that eventually led me to a web development agency in Fort Wayne, Research Design. And I was basically hired to help clients for whom we just built a big fancy website, figure out how to like use it with Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and like all of the social channels. And there, I realized that I really liked the sort of like strategy and communications portion of it, but I really wanted to like, figure out how to like apply that to like the building of their website. And I spent a lot of time with our front-end developers and our designers, and we really realized that like I can put these skills to use, like basically mapping out how content should look on the website and how to prioritize content and what the content should be, and then how to like map that to the back end so our clients could, easily update that content and when they should update that content and what it should say, that kind of a thing. And we quickly realized that there's a name for doing this thing. It's called content strategy. And my boss and I read this really great book that had just come out called The Elements of Content Strategy. I assume you can't all see this, but I'm holding up a copy of this book for Anthony right now by Aaron Kassane. And it was kind of an eye-opener. I was like, holy cow, this is exactly what I want to do. This is really interesting. It's taking a lot of the skills and interest I have in like writing for clarity and customizing messages for customers and applying it to something that's really great, which is user experience, UX. So started getting into that. A few years went by, and I talked to a guy I knew from following him on Twitter, who was a content strategist at Facebook. This was in 2014. And he was like, Andy, you should come apply at Facebook. And I'm just like, yeah, sure, whatever. Like, I work at a 6-person web agency in Indiana. Like, that's not going to happen. But I applied. They were really trying to build the team, and pretty soon I got a job offer. And Katie and I had like a few weeks to decide whether or not I was going to pack it all up and move to San Francisco, move to the Bay Area. So I did. Long story short, we did. We moved out here, worked on the content strategy team at Facebook for a few years. Eventually, it was a really great group of people. I learned a lot, and I really loved it. There were a lot of weird things happening in the world, and Facebook was at the center of a lot of those weird things,
and still is, yeah,
and still is. And it was just kind of a weird place to be. And eventually what kind of happened was there was this opportunity at Adobe that came up that a friend of mine shared with me. I don't know, Anthony, if you remember Brooke Francesi, who was a designer at Aptera. And she had since gone and become a designer at Adobe. And she was like, hey, Andy, you should apply for this job. It's perfect. So I did. And it was an opportunity to start a content strategy practice within Adobe Design, within our big product design org, and build a team and just kind of like do something really foundational. And that really appealed to me. So that's where I am. Been there for about 4.5 years. It's the longest I've ever been in a job because I'm a typical millennial. And
you're building a team of your own now, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I started in 2017. It was just me for about 9 months. Then I hired a couple more people, and we are about to hire our 10th person.
Yep. So when most people think of Adobe, they think of the products. At least I would imagine. You think of the Creative Suite and all the things that come with that. And someone might be inclined to ask, okay, so why does Adobe, which makes products, need a content strategy? So can you explain what exactly you're working on and why Adobe decided they needed this role and how that role has evolved? Yeah.
Well, one thing I should mention is that this, like the thing that I'm doing now within product at Adobe, is a very, very specific niche of content strategy. Some people, I generally call it content design. Some people call it UX writing, but it's basically creating the words that appear, like the interface words, right? Like, the labels of things and the terminology that you use and microcopy and error messages and button copy. And
so putting a tremendous amount of effort into stuff that should look effortless to the user.
Totally. Yeah. And it should be, I mean, if it goes well, it's invisible, right? Like you don't even realize that you're looking at it. If it goes poorly, which I'll be completely honest, there's a lot of very poor UX writing in Adobe products from over the years. I think everybody knows those just hilariously dense error messages that will happen, that your Photoshop has crashed and you get this ridiculous error message that you don't know what it means. That's because somebody really wasn't paying much attention to the words when they were writing that. So that's what we're trying to do. We have a long way to go. And there are other content strategists at Adobe who work on marketing surfaces or web experiences or corporate communications or learn content. This is our particular niche of it within the product org.
Got it. So you're not promoting Adobe's products. You are writing copy for the users of those products. Is that correct?
Totally. Yep. And just it's a slightly different approach. We're focusing less on something like a marketing copywriter would focus on, which might be like, inspiring and informing, value props, things like that, where we're focused so much on like clarity and usability and reducing friction for like accomplishing something.
Yeah, well, and there's a through line there from the interest in journalism, at least in my mind, because the initial interest is I want to make complex topics understandable to the average person. This is I want to make this experience understandable to the average person.
Absolutely,
there's a parallel there. But talk a little bit about. I know you think a lot about this topic. We'll talk in just a little bit about the book you co-authored, but. What's fulfilling to you about this work? Why do you think it's meaningful? How does it help people? How does it help your organization?
Yeah, it's so in an ideal state, like if we're doing our jobs correctly, we're really reducing friction and increasing retention. Like people are, I don't know what your experience with like big, scary professional creative tools are, but if you have a goal in mind, like you want to create a flyer or something like that, and you open Photoshop or Illustrator or InDesign, you're faced with just this sort of big empty screen, right? Like you're not quite sure where to get started, and you have this thing that you want to do in your mind, but you just don't know how to get started doing it. And you might click around, you might see like, oh, hey, there's all these like tools in Photoshop. I don't really know what they do or what these names are. I can't really figure out what I need to know in order to get started. Ideally, that's the thing we're helping with, right? Like we're writing we're naming tools and features in a way that's very like simple and easy to understand, kind of meeting the mental model of a new user or an experienced user. Sometimes those things are conflicting, sometimes they're not, and just really like giving them like a path to get started. So it really is like empowering people to use our tools and products better, right? And a big metric that we use that many companies that you have like subscription models use is this metric called time to value. And basically what that means is like the amount of time between when you sign up for something and when you feel like you're getting that value out of something. Ideally, that's really short, right? Because if they sign up for something and you're paying for it, hopefully right away you understand the value of it because you're paying for it. Sometimes that doesn't happen for months. And in the meantime, somebody might be like, why am I paying $50 a month for this? I'm just going to cancel. Yeah. So ideally, one of the things that we can kind of directly influence with our work is reducing that time to value and really letting people get into it from as early as possible.
Yeah, and I would assume that some of this is driven by the competitive environment because like most companies, Adobe has more competition now than ever before. And one of the things that is out there's a number of different solutions that at least claim to make the experience easy, even for unexperienced designers. Is this a response to that competitive environment? And if so, how does that relate to what you're doing?
Yeah. In some respects, I think it is. I think Adobe's interesting in that it's a pretty old company. Like it's been around for 35-ish years, and we have a lot of competitors in certain like markets and certain segments, but we don't really have any sort of like big holistic competitors. Like Microsoft, for example, is a company that looks very much like Adobe. It's actually much bigger than Adobe is, but they're not really competitors in how they like where our products kind of fit together. But at the same time, like they're very much like we're competitors of like building teams out, right? Like we hire a lot of the same people, and I think adding a content design practice to our design team, it was a good competitive move. By the time I started Adobe, there were more than 100 people doing this very thing at Facebook. Shopify, which is a big organization, has a bunch of content designers. It's part of a bigger full stack design team, and much in the way that people hire like UX researchers now, like in a big way. Sure. People hire like tech, like particulars, like systems designers and UX designers and visual designers. It's just part of a balanced meal of design. Yeah, and that's kind of what we were doing.
Yeah, and you're doing this work without having had a conventional training in web development. So I would assume you learned some of that language at Research and then have sort of learned as you go. How well would you say you know the coding world? Do you need to know it, or is that something you know enough to speak the language and that's good enough?
Yeah. I had just a personal interest in website building before even I worked at Research. So I had a basic working understanding of HTML and CSS and like PHP and some of those kind of languages. But I absolutely do not have any knowledge or experience of code in like developing software applications or like iOS or Android apps. I think that one can get into this role without understanding any of that. The thing that I think you need to understand or have an affinity for is just UX knowledge, right? Like UX, like user-centered design, or as IDEO calls it, design thinking. That's kind of a big term that people use nowadays. We used to call it human-computer interaction. HCI is a thing that if you went to IU Bloomington, they have a big school of like a big HCI school there. So it's something that I think is important to know. I think it's easy to learn if you already have a very like user-centered mindset, which I would argue journalism is a user, like instead of user, it's your reader, that you have a mindset to write for that audience. So there's a lot of parallels there. And I think that as long as you have the ability to have like a systems thinking approach to writing, you're kind of like set up for success in a role like that. So you can't, one thing I should mention is you can't get a degree in content strategy. Like that just doesn't exist. It's a newish and highly adapting and evolving role. And I think the University of Washington offers a course in strategic communication, which has a lot of those things built in. My friend and yours, Kristen Miller, who is teaching at St. Francis, is teaching a class in public relations, but she does a lot of talking about content strategy and applying like a UX mindset to that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like little pockets of people thinking about that stuff. There's a few certification programs, but it's not a formalized field in any way.
Sure. So,
yeah.
Well, one of the things I think you've spoken to, and I know as well, is that higher ed, as much as I love higher ed, it tends to be a little slow in bringing some of these skills into the classroom. So the folks who are doing this work, folks like you, your peers, what backgrounds do they tend to come from? Is it journalism, English, PR, that type of background, or is some of them coming from like software development and other areas?
Yeah, all of those things. I have an English degree with a journalism minor. I honestly think that my literature classes, which I loved, sets me up perfectly for this role because there's a lot of critical thinking involved. There's a lot of like I guess I would call like textual analysis. There's a lot of saying like, hey, this thing is very much like this thing, or like let's figure these out. Like all of those papers that I wrote about like the Bronte sisters in college is relevant to this role. Journalism, library science is, I think, a really good degree that like prepares you for a lot of this stuff. We have a few people with kind of like library and information science backgrounds. There's a lot of people who have design or web development backgrounds in this role. People who are like, I really understand deeply like how this stuff is made, but I think the stuff that really empowers me is the information architecture, like the structure of information and writing and words, and that I think really sets you up for success here. But there are people in this role from, gosh, like I know somebody who was like a chemistry major. I know somebody who has a PhD in archaeology, which sets her up for success. It's an interesting field for sure. I think the bigger thread is that people talk about how liberal arts programs aren't going to set you up to pay the bills, right? Like they're getting cut all over the place. That happened at IPFW before IPFW was kind of scuttled. Yeah. Like people are down on liberal arts programs, and this is a super lucrative field that your liberal arts degree will absolutely set you up for.
Yeah, well, and I agree with that for sure. As a fellow English major, when people ask me, what did being an English major prepare you to do, I say email. I'm really good at email because
Yeah.
it's a word problem, right? The client is in Nashville and the bus is traveling 60 miles an hour and there are 3 cases of beer on the bus. What's the bus driver's name? That's the problem I solve every day. I just do it through email instead of through, interpreting literature. So yeah, for sure.
Strategic communication, you can apply that toward interpersonal relationships. You can apply that toward communicating complicated things to users. You can apply that toward so many things. And people call it soft skills. And I think I don't know about you, but I know many people who are very good at coding and computer science and those hard skills who are very poor at talking to people.
Yeah.
So I might argue that soft skills are the hardest skills of all.
Well, let's rebrand that as hard skills. How's that? That sound good?
Exactly. Yeah.
That'll attract a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, in addition to thinking about this stuff, you have also co-authored a book called Writing is Designing, which you were good enough to send me a copy of. Thank you very much. Tell me a little bit about the book. What inspired it? How did you produce the book? And what have been some of the byproducts of writing that book?
Yeah. So the day before I went out to California to interview for this role at Facebook, I went to this workshop at Midwest UX, which is a big conference that kind of travels around the Midwest every year. Excuse me. And it was called something like Visual Communication for Writers. And it was basically, are you a writer on a team full of other designers and coders and things, and you need to communicate your ideas, but they're not going to read like a big, long like treatise that you've written. What are some ways you could do that? And so I was working in research design. This was a very relevant topic to me. And so it was taught by these 2 guys, Michael Metz and Scott Kuby. And super smart. I connected with them kind of after the workshop to just chat. Didn't think about it for another couple years and went on to work at Facebook. And I attended a conference called Confab, which is a large content strategy conference in Minneapolis every year. And I kind of reconnected with Michael Metz, who was teaching that workshop. And he and I were both in roles where we were thinking, like, there's a lot of broad content strategy topics being talked about at Confab, but nothing kind of in our niche. Nobody was really talking about the fundamentals of UX writing or how to think about voice and tone for products, things like that. And we were like, this is the stuff I'm interested in learning. We're not seeing that around here. And Michael was like, what if we pitched a workshop like that? So we did. And that was in 2015. And it was accepted, and we kind of kept on teaching this workshop at further confabs and then other organizations. We went to other conferences. We went to Singapore for Singapore Design Week and taught this workshop there. And eventually, Christina Halverson, who runs Confab and is kind of we call her the mother of content strategy. She literally wrote the book about content strategy for the web. And she connected us with this guy, Lou Rosenfeld, who has a publishing company about UX books, and he was looking for a book about UX writing, for doing this thing where you're writing words and interfaces and all this stuff kind of surrounding that. So we had this workshop. We had all this material. We had this thought. And we basically were like, what if, let's turn this into a book? So we did. We went through a year-long sort of proposal process. It was pretty intense. Took us about 8-9 months to write. Took us another few months to edit. We had this pretty intensive process of developmental editing, and finally published it in January 2020. And I think the thesis of the book is treating writing as a design practice. It's called Writing is Designing. A previous title that we went another way with was we're going to call it Designing with Words. So basically using language and words as design material instead of pixels or colors or rectangles or whatever you're designing with. And the reason we kind of framed it as such is because in our own careers, whenever we are working on large design teams trying to convince designers that, hey, we should be part of this process at every step along the way, instead of what would often happen, which is they would include us at the end and they would leave room in the design for like holes like that's with Lorem Ipsum text. And they're like,
here's your button, put something on it.
Fill in words in this word hole.
Yeah.
And which isn't really useful because we like, what if that's not the problem with the experience? What if you can't put a word Band-Aid on a design problem? And we're basically encouraging people to think about not these separate practices of writing and design, but thinking about writing as part of that design process. So that's where that came from, and that's kind of how we framed the book, because we spent less time on like the how-tos of writing, because if you want to be in this job, being a good writer is a given. Like that's table stakes, right? You need to do that. So what you need to think about is sort of that design practice. So it's basically a book about design for writers. Incidentally, also, I talked about Scott Kuby, that guy who Michael Metz, my co-author, was doing this workshop with. He is also a friend of mine since then, good friend of Michael's, and he wrote a book called Writing for Designers later on in kind of a completely parallel track. And so we like to joke that his book is writing but for designers, and our book is designing but for writers. So they're pretty complementary.
Yeah, it's chocolate and peanut butter, and
exactly.
Yeah. So, one of the things there that really strikes me as interesting is the lesson in repurposing content. You had a great workshop that, hey, this could be a book. This could be a number of different things. And in sort of a meta way, I interviewed you for my column, and now you're on the podcast, and we're talking about some of the same things.
Yeah.
So writers and designers, repurpose your content in as many ways as possible.
Absolutely. I know. So many people will write a book and then turn it into a workshop and kind of take that on the road. And we kind of went the opposite way, which has been really interesting because honestly, after writing the book, it helped us sort of repurpose our workshop again, which we've been doing virtually. Every once in a while, we'll offer like a public workshop that people have attended, which is cool.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people I know who have authored a book are working on their next one. Is that true for you? Do you have another book idea, or is it one was enough and don't want any part of that?
Maybe someday, but that was honestly one of the hardest things I've done, and I need a very long break from that. This is maybe the topic of a different podcast, but I have been a lot more interested in writing zines lately. It's just a fun, small project, and I get to do stuff like design my own cover and fold them in my house and send them to people. So I'm much more down for something like that right now.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you deserve a break after that. So for sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I want to turn to the speed round of the show and talk about a few of the things we've discussed, but in a little more of a concise way. So I want to talk first about career path, because, truly, of the people I know, you've worked for some of the most fascinating companies. And, I'm sure you have the opportunity to talk to people who aspire to work for the likes of Facebook and Adobe and who, aspire to work in the tech hub that you're part of the world. What's your best piece of advice, having come from really small nonprofits in Northeast Indiana to where you are? Not that is dependent upon any specific geography, but what's your best advice in terms of being successful in a career?
That's a great question. For me, what's been really successful is really trying to find a niche, right? Like I went from at the beginning of my career just really loving words and strategic communication in tech, and those are great. There's so many different kind of jobs you can get in that field. But when I kind of went from these very small jobs to working at this very large company with dozens of thousands of people, having a specific niche was really useful and important and a focus. I've talked to people when I worked at Facebook, when I work at Adobe, I talked to people who are like, hey, I would love to work at a big company like that. I am a front-end designer and developer. Is there a place for me there? And oftentimes there's not. You have to kind of focus in on do you want to be a designer or do you want to be a developer? And I hate that that's kind of a choice that somebody wants to make or somebody needs to make, but that's how these kind of companies hire. They hire for very specialized things. So if you have a specific specialized interest, pursue it and kind of grow in that area. And all of your other sort of general knowledge that you might already have will be super useful in supporting that particular choice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, and another follow-up question, because you've worked for really small organizations and done well there. What's the key there? Because for me, one of the things I've learned, and either is a choice and there's concessions either way, but I've found that I really like working for small organizations because I like variety. I don't want to do one specific thing. I want to do a number of things. And I'm admittedly much more of a generalist. But what are some of the lessons you learned about working and succeeding in small companies, as companies with 3 people and 6 people? What do you recommend people do if they want to succeed in that environment?
Yeah, easier said than done, because this is something I feel like I was not great at. But I think that being comfortable with and embracing ambiguity is really, really important. In my role at Research Design, for example, I was hired to do a really specific thing, and we sort of realized that there's this broader thing that I could do, or there's this very tangential thing from what I was hired to do that I could do, and it took a little bit of trying it out and a little bit of convincing both my boss and clients that this is marketable, this is something we can sell. And I think a lot of it was just being willing to step outside of your box and try stuff out. And that was hard and ambiguous. And we were creating documents and deliverables and processes that we thought was right, but we didn't have a name for it. What the heck is this thing we're trying to structure? And later on, we would find out oh, that's called a content model. That's something that is established in the world of content strategy. But at the same time, I had no idea what it is. I sort of knew what I wanted to accomplish, but I didn't quite know how to get there. And just kind of sticking with that. I think it's really easy to just stay in your lane and try stuff out. So a little bit, I guess I'm arguing for the opposite of what I was saying earlier, which is to specialize. But at the same time, I think doing that will kind of help you figure out what you need to do in order to focus and specialize and really develop a niche.
Yeah, and I think there's value in both, and really a need for both. That you have to have broad expertise, but there's an imperative to focus on one thing. When you and I were both super interested in social media when it first emerged, and I had an ambition. I want to be in Northeast Indiana. I want to be the social media guy. And then about 2 years in, I was like, this is nuts. There's way too much to know. And I kind of planted my flag. I'm okay being the LinkedIn guy. If people have questions, large questions about social media, I can help them with that. But I don't want to get into the weeds on some of the other platforms. So you can have it both ways, but you can't. You can have it both ways, but you can't specialize in everything within that more generalized expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to see. What am I trying to say? I think it's really good to just kind of follow where your thoughts and intuitions and interests guide you, right? I also was very much into, writing for social media and thinking about how businesses can use it in their world. And I kind of quickly realized that marketing, I had all of my seeds in the marketing garden, right? I really love that. And it took me a little while. And finally I was just I think we had a conversation about this. I was working at pencils.com, love pencils, love stationery. And I just realized oh shoot, I don't want to be working marketing. I want to write. I want to work in communications and writing and tech, but I don't want to be a marketer. And that was hard and led me eventually to this path, which is very related to marketing, but had let me do things that were different than the things that I would have to be doing if I was in a marketing role.
Sure. And well, I think there's another lesson in that. Just because you're good at something doesn't mean it's your destiny from a career standpoint.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So here's the hardest question I'm going to ask you. And I'm putting you on the spot because it's very meta. But I'd like to hear your thoughts. If somebody asked you to describe content strategies succinctly, somebody said, I don't have a lot of time, but tell me, what is content strategy? How do you describe it so someone who has no knowledge of it would understand the concept?
Really broadly, I would describe it as basically the planning and creation and maintenance of content. And by content, I mean broadly, content is so many things. In my specific part of the world, it is the words that appear in user interfaces and products, and also kind of in user experience, which can involve emails and the web and all those things as well. So that's probably how I'd really succinctly talk about it. Sometimes also I tell people that I am a writer on a design team, like a product design team. Mm-hmm. And that's a good way to describe it as well. And people are like, what do you write? And I'm just like, you know how when you use apps, they have all those words on there. That's the stuff that I write.
Yeah, it kind of demystifies it right there. But
yeah, somebody has to write those words, and it's amazing. People don't realize how focused you get on writing those words. Like, you can have meetings upon meetings to write like 2 sentences worth of words. It's a much different process than writing like a blog post.
Well, and I think that's reflective of what I think is one of the biggest communication challenges that we have today, and that is the difficulty and the challenge that comes with making it appear effortless. You know, the comparison I've always used is when I was an English major and I was writing in an academic way, I was creating these huge sculptures that were really bad. They were big, and now what I do is I take a big bad sculpture and chip away until only what is needed is there, and it's actually, in a lot of respects, way more difficult to send a good email about a difficult topic than it was to write a 5-page paper about Macbeth. It's just a different challenge. Not to denigrate the academic exercise, because there's value in it, but what people want today is clear and concise in a world where very little is clear and concise.
Yeah, yep. And it's to me it's really an interesting challenge in that you balance. Like when you're working on this, you're balancing times when you can focus more on the brand, right? Like you can be a little bit more friendly. You can reflect the brand a little bit more in your words. But sometimes you have to sort of like just focus on clarity, like kind of chip away the facade of the brand and just really get to kind of the core of what you're writing. And because sometimes if somebody's in a very confusing experience, or you're trying to tell them something specific, the brand voice is just too confusing and not understandable. But sometimes something's just really boring if you're trying to like get them to be engaged and you're trying to surprise and delight somebody. Like, you want a little bit of a friendliness or a brand voice. So that's one of the big things we talk about in our workshop and in our book, is we try to like help people come up with frameworks to identify when it's appropriate to use one or the other, and we call that voice and tone, basically.
Yeah. Well, and I would suspect that my suspicion is that younger audiences have way more highly attuned BS meters. You know, I'm Gen X, and we're still much more marketing tolerant, I think, than people your age and younger. And brands have to speak with much more of a conversational voice today in order for anybody to pay attention. That's my suspicion. I don't know if you agree, but yeah.
I agree. I mean, there's so much. Like, I really early on, like in my career, when I was just starting to think about this stuff, I think I just ran across the Clue Train Manifesto. Mm-hmm. And it was, when was it written? In the 90s? It's still another really relevant today.
Yeah, I have a small wing of my library that's all books that Andy Welfle has written.
I'm sort of surprised that I didn't learn about it from you in your workshop, but maybe I just like heard about it elsewhere. But yeah, I think it's extremely useful and foundational in the way that things happen now. It's basically like, hey, wouldn't it be great if brands didn't speak like some corporate monolith and had like a more kind of like authentic voice? Sometimes I think that you can take that too far, but sure. I definitely think that it is very foundational the way that we think about this and the way that I think about that.
Yeah. For sure. Well, I've got one more question for you, and you've been super generous with your time, especially since it is the middle of your day. It's nearly the end of mine, but one more question. And I'm gonna throw a little bit of a curveball. We've been talking on this podcast a lot about sort of what we've learned from COVID. I think kind of everyone's tired of that. So what I want to hear from you is, what you've learned from making a big move from Indiana to California. What have you learned about yourself or about your career path that you didn't know before that surprised you and you think will stick with you moving forward?
Ooh, that's a really great question. I Yeah. Give me a second here.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, the main reason like this move has been valuable is because I've been following career opportunities, right? Like I think that there's a lot of good careers in web development, in marketing, in things like that in Fort Wayne and in Northeast Indiana. But at some point after a LinkedIn search, I realized that I was the only content strategist that I could figure out that I knew in Indiana. And I really realized that like at one point, if I wanted to follow this niche and if I wanted to grow here, I was going to have to do that somewhere else. And I lived for 32 years of my life in Fort Wayne, and I built up a bunch of friends here. I, built up a career, and just it was my place. And in moving to San Francisco, we really love it. It's a wonderful place, amazing food, just really good culture, housing prices that are through the roof compared to what I was used to. But I made friends here. Like there's people here who I know, and this is home. And it's something where I think you can find your people anywhere, right? Like if you have people who are listening to this podcast who are moving from San Francisco or LA or New York or Denver or whatever to Fort Wayne, like that's great. Like you will find your people, you will find your niche, you'll find your group. Like it's a good move for you. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but it
does. Yeah. And go ahead. Sorry.
I also just really am able to kind of like see what value Fort Wayne has and brings. Like my family lives there. I'm going to be back there in a few weeks. I think it's a. Do you remember when Visit Fort Wayne or one of the chambers or somebody had that motto, "Room for Dreams"?
Yeah.
I
got a lot of negative backlash at the time. I remember. Yeah.
A lot of negative backlash. A lot of making fun of it that I certainly did. But now I'm like literal room. Like I live in a 700 square foot apartment. There's not a lot of room.
Yeah.
And luckily, my dreams don't take up a lot of room. Like I'm not trying to start a family. Like this works well for my life. But if I wanted to start a family, it would be extremely hard and expensive to do so, and it would be much easier to do in Fort Wayne. So I think that whoever worked on that motto was onto something, because if you are coming to Fort Wayne because you're pursuing a dream like that, like it's a good place to do it.
Yeah, well, we have to find snarky young Andy Welfle and slap him one for that. Yes.
Maybe that motto wasn't for me.
Yeah. Well, and my experience has been, kind of the opposite, moving from the Boston area to Northeast Indiana. I think there's value in just doing something different when you're relatively young. And like you, I really appreciate the fact that I have two places I can call home. I go back to Boston, and it's the people who knew me in high school and before. I'm here. This is where my professional network is. But it's good, and I applaud you for shaking things up a little bit and taking a risk, because it is a risk too.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, it was a risk. At one point, we were just like, I have this salary offer, which seemed astronomical. But then I would look at like rent prices, and I'm like, oh, that's probably not so astronomical after all.
Yeah.
And I think we were at a place where we were just like, let's see. Like, I would not assume that, Facebook would offer me a salary that was not livable in the Bay Area. So we did some things and made it work. And I absolutely feel like for me, I was able to advance in a career in a way that I wouldn't have been able to if I was in Fort Wayne at that time. And
Yeah,
that's not to say Fort Wayne is a bad place to pursue a career. Just at that point, not the one that I was trying to do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Andy, it has been truly amazing to watch what you've done and how you've grown and some of the things you've accomplished. It's amazing to see that growth. And I'm proud to know you. You do great work, and you're a great guy on top of all that. So I really appreciate it.
And let me just tell your listeners that I truly believe that it was, 2010, 2011? I can't remember when that workshop was, but it, like, your workshop there and your influence absolutely sort of like shifted my mindset and how one thinks about communications and the internet. So you are absolutely a key part of how I went down this path.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to end on that note because it doesn't get any better than that. And I'm not going to do anything else this week. I'm done. That's the best it can get. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Have a beer and enjoy the weekend.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Genuinely, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to this episode. We'll be back next week with another great guest, and we hope you'll join us then.